Let me ask this next question sent to CornyDriveThru at gmail.com from Eli in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. How was the Philadelphia area as a territory in the 70s and 80s? Were there any signs that it would go in the direction it did under ECW?
Oh, boy. Well, the Philadelphia area wasn't a territory in the 70s and 80s. It was part of, at first, the WWF territory, what came to be known as the WWF, and one of their biggest towns. What would you think? And we don't have exact business records for the 60s. There was a period of time where Vince Sr. was out of Madison Square Garden in the mid-60s, 66 to 68, or not out of the Garden necessarily, but they were off television in New York, is what I'm trying to say.
He lost the Garden in the early 60s because Pfeffer got it back briefly somehow.
That's right, just for 6 months or whatever.
Yeah.
But no, what I'm saying is, so the Garden wasn't drawing. They weren't doing big business in the Garden because they didn't have TV. So at that time, would Philadelphia have potentially been the big town in the Northeast territory at that time? Because that was before they got Buffalo.
Do you put Philly in front of Boston?
Well, that's true. Boston was huge, but Philly goddamn, Philly drew some big crowds, but maybe that was later on in the 70s. Boston was bigger in the 60s. Point is, you asked about Philly. Philly was one of the biggest towns consistently in the Northeast territory, the old WWF. And then when it was just such a great city for wrestling, when Crockett started expanding, well, first was the Pro Wrestling USA thing came to Baltimore. And then Crockett kind of took over that Northeastern expansion. And the two cities that we had incredible success in were Baltimore and Philadelphia. Crockett could never get into New York. Even when he did, the Nassau Coliseum, that thing was a goddamn clusterfuck. Whenever we went to New York State, in the smaller towns, it wasn't really very good. Boston, the first time Crockett went, the Boston Garden in April of 87, we did a $100,000 house, had over 10,000 people, but we couldn't keep it. It didn't do that well after that. The Northeast was a particular kind of fan that liked the WWF style, but because Philly and Baltimore were just such wrestling crazy towns, and there was a building that in each that was comparable to where Vince was running. For a while, when we ran Baltimore at the Civic Center, they were doing Cap Center in Landover. But anyway, those two towns went for both styles of wrestling. And specifically in Philly, it was a lot of people who didn't get into the WWF anymore by the 80s because it had gotten too cartoon. Philadelphia loved blood and guts and violence and fights. And they got that more with Crockett than they did at that era with Vince's products. So, that was also the first place. Philly, even more than I think New York, blossomed the first group of smart fans because when it initially happened, it was like the spread of COVID. They were all around each other because they were that hardcore group of fans that hung out at the hotel or waited for the guys at the airport or whatever. And so it became more of an area that smart fan tailored shows like Joel Goodhart's. Let's do these dream matches. Let's have the Sheik versus Abdullah the Butcher. If we did that match on a WWF show, it wouldn't draw 15 cents, but we'll sell it to these fans that are listening to the radio show and it'll draw a fortune. So, yeah, you could kind of see that Philadelphia was going to go to a different style and something different just because we used to joke about it. The boys, when we'd go up there, we'd say, well, they're going to fucking boo the shit out of the dynamic dudes because they hate them, because they love us, because it's Philly and they like the heels and the horsemen. If it was Charleston, South Carolina, it'd be exact opposite. But
man, I'll tell you, when I was 12, I went to Halloween Havoc 92, one of the worst shows ever in Philly. But the opening match made it worth it. The opening match in Philly, you had a babyface team of the Z-Man, Johnny Gunn, who was Tom Brandi, and Shane Douglas, who got booed I mean, they were baby faces. I'd never experienced anything like this. They got booed brutally, and then the heels come out to a thunderous babyface pop. And it was to Bad Street USA, Bobby Eaton, Arn Anderson, and Michael P.S. Hayes.
Yeah.
And Philly exploded. I'd never experienced anything like that, where the heels were the most over guys on the show.
Well, Philly was where we beat, the Midnight beat Tully and Arn for the belts when Tully and Arn were leaving. So that cemented us there in Philly because they knew they had gotten an unplanned title change. Philly loved the Four Horsemen, and the Horsemen loved Philly, and all those promos that Flair did about the Marriott or the Airport Marriott, that was legitimate. And Michael Hayes, the Free Bird with the goddamn music. But that was the same place at the Civic Center in 89, Midnight versus Dynamic Dudes, the famous night where they brought the big sign, and all of a sudden we're getting heat on fucking Shane in the match as normal, and the people start chanting, "Johnny sucks dick! Johnny sucks dick!" And I look up and somebody's got a white bed sheet and they've spray painted "Johnny sucks Shane's dick." And they've hung it over the fucking general admission railing up in the building, and everybody's chanting that. And fucking Johnny Ace is standing over there in a corner with his head down, and they're getting heat on Shane. And fucking the Midnight brings Shane over to get the shot with the racket right at ringside, and I turned around and walked off away from him. And later on, he's like, "Why didn't you hit me?" I said, "I was afraid to get too close of you. There might have been snipers," right? They just hated the fucking baby faces. And it turned when we started going to Philly in 86 at the Civic Center, late 85. That's when Dennis Coralluzzo and Frank Chili used to have to get me and Bobby Eaton and Dennis Condrey after the matches. And to get out the back door, they'd have Gino Moore back his panel van up, and they'd rush us out the back door and slam the doors, and Gino would try to drive through the people, and you'd see the fucking sides of the van bowing in where the people were beating on it trying to get to us because they hated us, wanted to kill us. And fucking less than 3 years later, we were the most popular tag team in town, and we were still heels. So it completely changed between 85 and 88. And when we first started going up there, I thought, of any town that we work for Jim Crockett, we're going to have a riot here at the Philadelphia Civic Center. We will cause a riot in this building and somebody's going to get hurt. That was the crowd. And 2 years later, like I said, fuck the Midnight Express before anybody else gave a shit as far as cheering us. That was Philadelphia.
And again, the fans were unique. They were cheering the heels and cheering violence before a lot of other fans, especially here in the Northeast. And a lot of those fans who sat ringside at the NWA shows would be sitting ringside at the Joel Goodhart shows. How much credit do you think Joel Goodhart deserves for, or how much blame do you think he deserves, depending on how you see it, for the Philadelphia style, the future ECW style?
Well, no, because think about this. Goodhart started running. It was after we were on one of his first shows. Stan and I quit in 1990, so he didn't start running until, I guess 1991.
No, 1990. And he was running in 90.
Okay.
Yeah.
The fans were already going in that direction. They were already the smartest group, and I mean that in terms of insider wrestling knowledge, not necessarily overall intelligence. And I had many friends in Philly, but some of them were, but they were a group of smart fans. They already liked the violence. They already liked the blood. Joel Goodhart started booking shows specifically for those fans rather than the ones that went to the WWF at the Spectrum, or even by that point WCW at the Civic Center. The dream, like we talked about this on a program here recently, Abdullah the Butcher versus the Sheik. In 1991, that match was for the hardcore fan that knew that was something of nostalgia days. He tried to put together Nature Boy Buddy Rogers versus Buddy Landell. He had me and Stan Lane wrestle as a team as the Midnight Express against Bobby and Jackie Fulton, the Fantastics. He brought in names that, that would appeal to the hardcore newsletter reading, tape trading fan, but that were intended to draw crowds of 2,500 to 3,000 people instead of 10,000. And that's what, with Goodhart, he was drawing those big crowds of 2,500 to 3,000 people in that building he was running, but he was paying, not only did he fly almost everybody in on the whole card, but he was paying big money to some of these guys to do these things. The Sheik was not wrestling regularly in 1991. It took a bit to get him over from Michigan. I think me and Stan got $1,000 or $1,500 a piece back then for that. So he was drawing crowds that were about as big as his building could hold, and he was still losing money. But he was doing it because he wanted. And where does this sound familiar? He wanted to put these dream matches together on his shows and be noted as the guy that could book these matches that nobody else could present to the fans. And it was like, instead of writing it down in his notebook in his basement as a fan, now he was actually buying the plane tickets and paying the money to have these guys come do it. And the last show he was going to do was the Landell versus Buddy Rogers match, which they could have had a heck of a match, because both of Buddy was smart enough to do anything Buddy Rogers wanted to do. And, you know, they would have done something that would have been entertaining, but he folded up. Goodhart did, took all the ticket money, went underground. Nobody saw him for ages because he had, even though he was practically selling that building out, he was losing money. And then that led to the people in Philadelphia thinking, okay, now we're supposed to get all these goddamn revolutionary smart fan matches that nobody else gets. And that's when ECW and, you know, started filling that void. And Paul Lee had more of an idea of building an ongoing modern business. Goodhart wanted to do nostalgia and bring in the stars that he liked and put on those special matches. And Todd Gordon was probably just happy to be in the wrestling business. I think Paul Lee saw that's why he figured out however it was that he Iggy'd Eddie Gilbert out. Paul Lee probably just winded.
I don't think Eddie did himself any favors. Remember, Todd hires Eddie full time to move to Philadelphia and produce a Memphis-style wrestling show in Philly.
Yeah.
And Eddie's personal problems got in the way, and he started having problems with Todd, and Paul was there and always ambitious and always looking to book. So while he certainly screwed over his friend in a sense, Eddie was going one way or another. Todd had enough.
I'm sure that Paul was there telling Eddie everything he needed to hear to wind him up even further on whatever he was upset about. I've told you what Paul did to me when I quit, right? WCW.
No.
Oh, fuck. After me and Stan walked out of WCW that time, Paul Lee was one of the people that thought it was a negotiating tactic. And he would call me at my house in Charlotte. But he did this 3 or 4 times, maybe once a month. I can't remember how, but you got them right where you want them. They're going to give you anything you want. I said, Paul, I'm not coming back. I don't care. I hate Jim Herd. I don't want to be there. I'm done. I'm going to do something else. Okay. Right. And then I'd hear from him that you got them right where you want them. They're dying to get you back. They'll give you anything. Paul, this is not a negotiating tactic. I'm not coming back. Of course, I think he was probably trying to make sure and reassure himself that I wasn't coming back, but he would do that. And then he would talk about, after he'd asked you and say, well, they'll do anything, right? Then he'd say, well, so-and-so and such, and he'd paint a picture of what a prick Herd was and how they were fucking everything up to make it like, why would anybody want to come back here? But you're going to get them for everything you want. He's trying to backhand. He knows I'm not coming back. I'm telling him. Of course, with Paul, there's an element of he wouldn't believe anybody because he'd never tell anybody the truth himself. But he wanted to make sure by reminding me how miserable it was, at the same time getting reassured I wasn't coming back. But I mean, he'd be the kind of guy that would put his arm around your fucking shoulder and walk you to the door as he was talking to you about how you ought to stay. So I'm sure that he was probably winding Eddie up, you know, agreeing with Eddie and taking the support position of Eddie. So on whatever Eddie's issue was, that's the way that it's the same thing as we talked about the Dark Side of the Ring episode with Dynamite Kid, when a talented ribber and shit disturber like Curt Hennig can just say the right thing at the right time when somebody is already leaning in a direction to send them all the way off the edge in that direction. But anyway, once Paul E got it, then he turned it into more of an ongoing modern promotion with new faces and etc. For what it's the same time as grunge, and he'd seen what Philly liked, so he tried to appeal to the smart fan that was already there, and then tried to make more smart fans by smartening more people up. And it was like everything else Paul does. It works until it doesn't, because he can keep it floating for a while because he's so smart, and he just in some cases he can stave off the inevitable for a while. But it was only going to go so far, because Paul E was really, Smoky Mountain got too big to be small, but was too small to be big. Paul E really got ahead of himself in terms of pay-per-view and all that stuff that was way above the reach of their television network or their infrastructure as a company. And they just, they dribbled the ball for a long time, but they finally had to fucking, let it go. And so and then somebody said, when we did that business comparison a while back, somebody said, well, Paul went out of business because he was owed millions of dollars from the pay-per-view company. Well, if he was owed millions of dollars from the pay-per-view company, why didn't he take the millions of dollars that they would have had to pay him eventually if it was a real deal and buy ECW back out of the bankruptcy thing? There were no millions of dollars that were coming in that were going to change the situation at that point in time.
Well, Jim, Paulie tried to hold on to a lot there, and of course we've all seen that he did spend a lot of time trying to hold on to his hair. He finally gave up on that. You have to wonder what else is going on with Paulie and body hair.
Well, I'll tell you what, the absolute worst transition in the history of podcasting advertising. We go from Paul Heyman to Manscaped. I don't know if Paul Heyman has ever manscaped himself. He looks very unsavory in all the parts that are visible. I can't imagine that the parts that are invisible and hidden from polite view would be any more attractive. But folks, if you're growing the Amazonian rainforest between your legs, or maybe the stench coming from your crotchal area would gag a maggot off a gut wagon or smell like a man eating fromunda cheese in a septic tank of a slaughterhouse, regardless, you need to groom yourself better. It's summertime. Father's Day's just around the corner. You might need a gift for your hairy father. It's hotter out there. We need to keep sleek and trim so mildew doesn't set in. So with hot weather, with Father's Day, and just a general lack of personal grooming from some male members of society that I've seen, you need the folks at Manscaped. And right now, the brand new Lawnmower 4.0, 4.0, the finest personal grooming product yet invented, and one of the nicest appliances I've got in my home, along with the Ultra Smooth package, is perfect for you right here at this time for Father's Day or any day or Summer's Day. The Lawnmower 4.0, waterproof, 7,000 RPM trimmer with the skin-safe technology. It's helped reduce ball nicking around the world. There's a multi-function on and off switch. There's a travel lock so it doesn't start vibrating in your bag on the plane. The Lawnmower 4.0 has a 4,000K LED spotlight so you can backlight those pubic hairs and make them look like the redwood forest. There's guard links, etc. And also in the Ultra Smooth package, the crop exfoliator keeps your groin feeling refreshed and reducing the risk of ingrown hairs. The crop gel, you can see where you're shaving, it's clear gel. And the crop shaver with precision blades, including extra wide lubricating strips, a pivoting head. I always want my head to pivot. Pivoting head is the best kind of head. Anyway, if you go to manscaped.com, what's the matter with you? If you go to manscaped.com/JCE, you can get 20% off and free shipping for the perfect package. The Lawnmower 4.0 is part of the Ultra Smooth package. So the Manscaped Ultra Smooth package 20% off and free shipping at manscaped.com/JCE. Make sure your head is pivoting head.
Well, let's quickly pivot to another question here,
Because
Jim.
sometimes they just go up and down, and that can get old and boring. But pivoting head
At the Marriott.